All right, everybody, buckle up because this deep dive is going to take us into some seriously controversial territory, World War II history style.
You think you know World War II, but then you pick up a book like Sean McMeekin's Stalin's War, and suddenly, bam!
Total perspective shift, right? I mean,
Yeah.
we're talking about a whole new way of looking at the conflict.
It's not just a new perspective, it's like McMeekin saying, hey, what if the whole thing, at least in the East, was more about Stalin's ambitions than just stopping Hitler?
And that's the thing about McMeekin's work. He doesn't shy away from bold claims.
He really doesn't. But the guy's got the research to back it up, using all these newly released Russian documents.
So we're not here to rewrite history, but we are going to dive into his book and see if his claims hold water, compare it to what we thought we knew.
And a good place to start, I think, is actually before the war breaks out, back when Stalin's consolidating his power in the Soviet Union.
Okay, so we're talking purges, the Gulag system, that whole terrifying period.
Right, and it's easy to think of that as, like, purely internal Soviet stuff.
But it totally shaped how Stalin acted on the world stage, right?
Absolutely. I mean, this is a guy who was inherently suspicious of capitalist nations, even when they were cooperating with them.
Case in point, the U.S. recognizing the Soviet Union in 1933.
Right, on the surface, it's like, okay, maybe things are thawing a bit, but then you dig a little deeper
And you realize Stalin's using American investment to build up his military. Plus, he's got spy rings operating right under America's nose.
the irony is thick with that one, and McMeekin really doesn't let you forget it.
It's like this constant double game, and it makes you wonder how much of Stalin's supposed ideology was just him grabbing for power, you know?
Oh, I think that's a huge part of it, and you see it even more clearly with something like the Spanish Civil War.
Yeah, wasn't he supposed to be this champion of the downtrodden fighting fascism wherever it reared its ugly head?
Well, the Spanish Republic did have a lot of gold reserves, and Stalin was more than happy to arm them. At a markup, of course.
It's like, hey, helping the working class is great and all, but let's not forget about those sweet, sweet profits.
Exactly, and it gets even more cynical when you look at the war between Japan and China.
Oh man, didn't he supply weapons to both sides at some point?
He sure did. Anything to keep that conflict going a little longer, weaken a potential rival in the process.
It's brutal, but it makes sense from his perspective, I guess.
It's all about playing the long game, securing Soviet power no matter the cost.
Which brings us to what has to be one of the most shocking deals of the 20th century, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact.
Right, the infamous Nazi-Soviet non-aggression pact shook the world when it happened.
And, I mean, for Hitler, the motivation's pretty obvious, but for Stalin...
Well, McMeekin argues it was a stroke of, if you can call it that, dark genius.
Buys him time to build up his forces, grabs some territory in the bargain, and maybe, just maybe, he's thinking it'll trigger a war between the capitalist powers.
It's chilling how much his actions mirror Hitler's in this period.
It really is, and nowhere is that more apparent than in what happens to the Baltic states.
Right, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, often overshadowed by the invasion of Poland, but just as brutal.
And that threat from Molotov to the Estonian foreign minister, like, where is Poland now?
Talk about wielding fear as a weapon, it's just chilling.
Sets the stage for everything that's coming, like a curtain falling before the storm, you know?
And that storm is about to hit. First, with the Winter War against Finland.
Which, okay, the Red Army didn't exactly have a stellar showing there.
No, they really struggled against the Finns.
But it showed the lengths Stalin was willing to go to get his way, how many lives he was willing to sacrifice.
And that right there, that's a theme you see throughout Stalin's entire reign, the human cost of his ambitions.
A cost that's about to skyrocket as Hitler launches Operation Barbarossa, his invasion of the Soviet Union.
Yeah, and at that point, the world holds its breath, wondering what's going to happen next.
I mean, you'd think with all the intelligence reports Stalin was getting about a potential invasion, he would have been more prepared for Barbarossa.
You'd think so, right?
Yeah.
But that's where McMeekin throws us a curveball. He says Stalin was so suspicious, so distrustful, that he actually ignored a lot of those warnings.
Paranoid much.
Totally. And it's not just paranoia about, like, foreign agents. He's convinced his own people are lying to him, trying to trick him.
Yeah.
McMeekin even says Stalin was certain Hitler wouldn't attack until 42, convinced he had more time.
And to make matters worse, he'd just spent the last few years purging his own military leadership. Talk about shooting yourself in the foot.
Right. It's like this incredible self-inflicted wound. The very people who might have helped him prepare for a German invasion were gone, victims of his own purges.
It's almost unbelievable the level of distrust there.
It really is, and the impact on the Red Army was catastrophic. You see these mass surrenders early in the war, and it's partly because Soviet soldiers are terrified of being captured by their own side.
You mean the NKVD, Stalin's secret police? Those guys were ruthless.
No kidding, and they were everywhere. So these soldiers are caught between a rock and a hard place, facing a brutal enemy in front and potential execution by their own side if they retreat.
It's a no-win situation, just awful. And then you've got Stalin's response to the invasion, this scorched earth policy.
Yeah, that was brutal. I mean, can you imagine being told to burn your own crops, destroy your own homes?
It's hard to even wrap your head around that level of destruction.
But that's Stalin for you. Always willing to make these huge, devastating gambles. And in this case, the gamble was to deny the Germans any resources as they advanced.
It's a strategy born of desperation, you know. But of course, it's the ordinary Soviet citizens who suffer the most.
Millions displaced, facing famine. It's a humanitarian crisis on a massive scale.
And yet, through it all, Stalin manages to pull off this incredible feat, forging an alliance with the Western powers.
Yeah, talk about strange bedfellows, right? You've got Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin all united against Hitler.
The enemy of my enemy is my friend, as they say.
Exactly. It was a marriage of convenience for sure, driven by necessity.
But we can't overlook just how important American aid was to the Soviet war effort.
Oh, absolutely. Lend-Lease was a lifeline for the Soviets, providing them with everything from tanks and planes to food and boots.
And McMeekin really gets into the nitty-gritty of that relationship.
He does. And it's fascinating, isn't it? Like, we often think of it as this blank check from Roosevelt, but Stalin was asking for very specific things.
Like what?
Oh, you name it. Aluminum, anti-aircraft guns, certain types of trucks. Stalin knew exactly what he needed, and he wasn't afraid to ask for it.
Sounds like he had Roosevelt over a barrel, especially with the Eastern Front being such a meat grinder.
Yeah, and Harry Hopkins, who was essentially Roosevelt's right-hand man on Lend-Lease, he seems to have been willing to give Stalin almost anything he asked for.
Really? Even if it meant, like, shortchanging American forces?
McMeekin suggests that happened on more than one occasion. It really shows how vital the U.S. saw the Eastern Front in defeating Hitler.
It makes you wonder, though, how much was Stalin truly committed to this alliance, you know? I mean, his ultimate goal wasn't just defeating fascism, was it?
No, I think you're right. There was always this other agenda at play, this desire to expand Soviet influence, especially in Eastern Europe.
And that's where the Yalta Conference comes in, right? This big meeting to hash out the post-war order.
Right. And on paper, it's this meeting of equals. Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin, the big three, deciding the fate of the world. But McMeekin argues that Stalin was playing 3D chess while everyone else was playing checkers. Meaning he ran circles around them. He managed to secure Soviet control over huge swaths of Eastern Europe, despite all those promises of free election.
Promises that were quickly broken, of course.
Of course. Millions ended up trapped behind what would become the Iron Curtain, living under Soviet domination.
And even the fall of Berlin, which you think would be this moment of unadulterated joy, it's overshadowed by the brutality of the Red Army's occupation.
It's something McMeekin doesn't shy away from at all.
The looting, the rapes, the reprisals.
It's all there, and it's a stark reminder that victory in war doesn't erase the capacity for cruelty.
And it wasn't just random acts of violence either, right? McMeekin talks about how systematic it was, the dismantling of East German industry.
Oh yeah, they stripped those factories bare, shipped entire assembly lines back to the Soviet Union as reparations.
It's like this giant forced transfer of wealth and technology.
Exactly, and it all feeds back into McMeekin's main argument, this idea that World War II, for Stalin, was as much about conquest and expansion as it was about defeating fascism.
And for those who ended up on the wrong side of the Iron Curtain, the end of the war wasn't liberation, it was just the beginning of a new kind of oppression.
A new form of tyranny with Stalin at its head. And that really makes you question, what did the average person in the West even know about what was happening over there?
Did they understand the implications of Stalin's actions, the true cost of his victories?
That's the million-dollar question. And it's one of the things McMeekin really wants us to think about.
It's heavy stuff, but it's important to grapple with it,
Absolutely. We can't just sanitize history and pretend it didn't happen.
Well said. And it makes me think about something else McMeekin brings up, this idea that Stalin was willing to sacrifice anyone and anything to achieve his goals.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, we've talked about the purges, the scorched earth policy, but then there's this whole other level of ruthlessness that's just Chilling. It's like that whole thing with the Warsaw Uprising in 44, just heartbreaking.
Oh, man, talk about a punch to the gut. You've got these Polish resistance fighters risking everything to liberate their city from the Nazis.
And Stalin's just sitting on his hands, holding back the Red Army.
McMeekin argues that Stalin actually wanted the Nazis to crush the uprising
Wait, seriously, why would he do that?
because a successful uprising, led by the Polish resistance, that didn't fit with his post-war plans.
He'd rather have a weakened Poland, easier to control, right?
Exactly. It's cold-blooded, but from Stalin's perspective, it's strategic. It's about securing Soviet dominance in the region, no matter the cost.
And the cost, in this case, is thousands of Polish lives.
It's a tragic illustration of how, for Stalin, even wartime alliances, even the fight against fascism, always took a backseat to his own ambitions.
It's tough to square that with the whole good versus evil narrative we often associate with World War II.
Right. But that's why McMeekin's book is so valuable. It forces us to confront these uncomfortable truths.
It doesn't shy away from the moral complexities, that's for sure.
And it reminds us that history is rarely black and white. It's full of shades of gray.
Definitely makes you think twice about the whole greatest generation label, doesn't it?
It does, yeah. Not to diminish the sacrifices that were made, but it's a reminder that even within the good guys, there were deep flaws, conflicting agendas.
And those flaws had real consequences, especially for those caught on the wrong side of the Iron Curtain.
Exactly. The end of the war wasn't a clean break, a happy ending for everyone. For millions, it was just the start of a new kind of struggle.
It's a sobering thought, and it's something we need to keep in mind as we look back on that period.
Absolutely. We can't just whitewash history or try to fit it into a neat little box.
We have to grapple with it in all its messy complexity.
And that's what makes studying history so important. It challenges our assumptions, forces us to confront difficult questions.
And maybe, just maybe, it helps us avoid repeating the mistakes of the past.
Here's hoping, because as they say, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it.
Wise words. And on that note, I think we're going to have to wrap up this deep dive. But honestly, this conversation could go on for hours.
Oh, for sure. We've just scratched the surface of McMeekin's book, and there's so much more to unpack.
And we want to hear from you. What are your thoughts on Stalin's role in World War II? Did Stalin's war challenge your perceptions? Head over to our social media and let us know. This is a conversation that deserves to continue, so let's keep it going.
Absolutely. Let's hear those perspectives. Because the more we engage with history, the richer our understanding of the present becomes.
Couldn't agree more. All right, everyone, that's it for this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep learning.